The clinking of silverware against porcelain felt like a countdown. Each scrape of a fork, each polite cough from a nearby table, was another second Nadia was trapped. The emerald green silk of her dress, chosen to inspire confidence, now felt like a cage, clinging to her skin under the oppressive heat of her date's gaze. Her phone was a dead weight in her lap, a lifeline she was terrified to use, but couldn't bear to put away. Her thumb hovered over the screen, the words already typed out, a desperate flare sent into the digital void. This date feels wrong. She pressed send, the tiny whoosh of the message disappearing into the ether, feeling both like a betrayal of hope and a prayer for rescue. Her friend Layla's name sat at the top of the chat, a silent recipient of her panic. Across the table, Marcus was talking, or rather, pontificating. He gestured with a hand large enough to palm a basketball, a thick gold watch glinting under the dim, ambient light of the restaurant. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated through the polished oak table, a sound meant to convey power, but which only communicated a deep, resonant arrogance. He hadn't asked her a single question about herself in the 47 minutes they'd been seated. He had, however, detailed his portfolio, his workout regimen, and the precise torque of his imported sports car. Now his hand, which had been resting innocently on the table, slid across the white linen and landed squarely on her knee. It wasn't a gentle touch, it was a claim. Nadia flinched, a barely perceptible tremor. "You're quiet," Marcus observed, his thumb drawing a slow, proprietary circle on her leg. "A woman as beautiful as you shouldn't be so serious." "Smile a little," his words were a command disguised as a suggestion. She forced a tight, brittle smile that felt like cracking glass. From a corner booth, shrouded in the elegant shadows the restaurant cultivated, a man watched. His name was Jinwoo, and his dinner of braised short ribs had grown cold. He had noticed her the moment she walked in, a vision in green, her posture radiating a nervous hope that he recognized all too well. He had also noticed the man she was with, the way his chest was puffed out, the way his eyes roamed the room as if assessing his territory. Jinwoo was a student of human behavior, a necessity in his line of work. And what he saw at that table was not a date. It was a predator cornering its prey. He watched her subtle shifts, the way her shoulders tensed when Marcus leaned in, the way her gaze darted towards the exit. He saw her phone light up in her lap. He couldn't read the words, but he understood the sentiment perfectly. It was a silent scream. The blue checkmark appeared next to her message. Delivered. Read. Layla was probably busy, or maybe she thought Nadia was just having first date jitters. "He's a great guy, Nadia," Layla had insisted over the phone 2 days ago, her voice bubbling with the unshakable optimism of a serial matchmaker. Successful, confident. "You need that after everything with Daniel." The mention of her ex's name was like a phantom chill. Daniel had been confident, too. His confidence had started as a comforting blanket and slowly morphed into a suffocating shroud, dictating her friendships, her clothes, her very thoughts. "Confidence is one thing," Nadia had replied, twisting the phone cord around her finger. "Arrogance is another," Layla had sighed dramatically. "You're overthinking it. Just give it one night." "What's the worst that can happen?" Nadia now had her answer. The worst that could happen was this slow, creeping violation of her space, her spirit. It was the sickening realization that she had walked right back into the same kind of cage she'd just fought so hard to escape. Marcus was leaning forward now, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone. "You know, I can tell a lot about a woman by her drink order. A glass of Sauvignon Blanc. It says you're classic, but you play it safe," he smirked. "I'm going to have to teach you how to live a little." He snapped his fingers at a passing waiter, a sharp, ugly sound that made Nadia jump. "We'll have a bottle of the Barolo. And 2 steaks rare." "She'll have the filet." He didn't look at her, didn't ask. He simply decreed it. The waiter, a young man with tired eyes, glanced at Nadia for a fraction of a second, a flicker of sympathy in his expression before he nodded and scurried away. The humiliation was a hot flush that crawled up her neck. She felt small, invisible, like a beautiful accessory Marcus had chosen to complement his evening. He was building a narrative around her without her consent, casting her in a role she didn't want. Every word he spoke chipped away at the fragile wall of self-worth she had been painstakingly rebuilding for the last 6 months. She wanted to stand up, to say something, anything. But the ghost of Daniel was at the table with them, whispering in her ear, reminding her how arguments escalated, how making a scene was always her fault. So she sat there, a silent statue in a green silk dress, her hands clenched in her lap, her heart hammering out a rhythm of pure, unadulterated dread. His hand was back, this time sliding from her knee up her thigh, his fingers pressing into the muscle with an unnerving firmness. It was a gesture of ownership, bold and unapologetic in the crowded restaurant. "You're tense," he murmured, his breath a warm, unwelcome cloud of expensive cologne and red wine.
"Relax."
"I don't bite. Unless you want me to." The grin that followed was predatory, turning his handsome features into something grotesque. Nadia's body went rigid. She carefully lifted his hand off her leg with her own trembling fingers and placed it back on the table. "I'm fine," she said, her voice thin and reedy. "I'd just prefer it if you didn't." His smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Don't be shy. A man's supposed to touch his date. It's how we get to know each other." He made it sound like a biological imperative, an undeniable truth. She took a desperate sip of water, the cold glass a small, solid anchor in a sea of discomfort. She had to regain control of the conversation, steer it into safer waters. "So, Layla tells me you work in finance," she began, forcing a brightness into her tone that felt utterly fake. "That must be fascinating." Marcus waved a dismissive hand. "It's numbers. I'm good at it. It pays for the lifestyle." He leaned back, patting his flat stomach. "What's more interesting is this. All this," he gestured to his own muscular frame. "You don't get this sitting behind a desk. 3 hours in the gym, 6 days a week. That's dedication. That's power." Across the room, Jinwoo set down his chopsticks with a quiet, deliberate click. He had been monitoring the escalating tension, the subtle language of her discomfort that was screaming louder than any spoken word. He saw the forced smile, the rigid posture, the way she clutched her water glass like a shield. He saw the man's repeated physical advances and her increasingly desperate deflections. He knew this dance. He had seen it play out in boardrooms, in back alleys, and in his own fractured family history. It was the universal ballet of the bully and the besieged. The man across from her wasn't interested in a partner. He wanted a possession. And the light in her eyes, the very thing that had drawn his attention, was beginning to dim under the weight of it all. He signaled for his check, his movements economical and precise. His meal was unfinished, his evening interrupted, but something else had taken priority. He would give her one more chance to leave on her own. If she couldn't, he would have to open the door for her. The final straw was the hand on her back. The steaks had arrived, bloody and enormous on their white plates, and as Nadia leaned forward to pick up her knife, Marcus's hand slid from the back of her chair onto the bare skin exposed by the dress's low cut. His fingers were cold against her warm skin. "That dress looks better when you sit up straight," he said, his voice a low growl of appreciation that made her stomach churn. "Shows off your assets," that was it. The dam of her composure, already cracked and leaking, finally broke. She pulled away sharply, her chair scraping against the polished floor. Every head in their vicinity turned. "Please," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Do not touch me again." Marcus's face darkened, the charming facade crumbling to reveal the raw entitlement beneath. "What is your problem?" he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "I'm giving you a compliment. You should be grateful a guy like me is even looking at you." A shadow fell over their table, long and sharp in the curated twilight of the restaurant. Nadia looked up to see a man standing there. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his black hair impeccably styled. He wasn't physically imposing like Marcus, but he carried an aura of stillness, a centered gravity that seemed to bend the room around him. It was the man from the corner booth. He wasn't looking at Marcus. His dark, intelligent eyes were fixed on her, and in them, she saw not pity, but a calm, unwavering question. "Is this man bothering you?" His voice was quiet, a low baritone with a subtle accent she couldn't quite place. It cut through the restaurant's murmur, sharp and clear. Marcus scoffed, turning in his seat to face the intruder. "Mind your own business, buddy. This is a private conversation." Jinwoo's gaze finally shifted to Marcus. The change was chilling. His eyes, which had been questioning and almost gentle when looking at Nadia, became flat and cold, like polished river stones. There was no anger, no aggression, just a profound and terrifying emptiness that seemed to look straight through Marcus and find him utterly wanting. "I believe the lady has asked you to stop touching her," Jinwoo said, his voice still level, still quiet, but now laced with something as hard as steel. "I suggest you listen," Marcus, fueled by ego and wine, started to rise from his chair. "And who the hell are you to suggest anything?" The moment was a breath held too long, a string pulled taut to its breaking point. Jinwoo didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a single threatening gesture. He simply leaned down slightly, his lips near Marcus's ear, and spoke a few words. The language was Korean, the tone conversational, almost placid. Nadia couldn't understand what was said, but she saw the effect with perfect clarity. The color drained from Marcus's face, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed mask of fear. His bravado, so immense just seconds before, evaporated like mist. It was as if Jinwoo hadn't spoken words, but had instead injected ice directly into his veins. Marcus stumbled back, his chair clattering against the floor. His eyes, wide with a primal terror, darted from Jinwoo back to Nadia and then to the exit, as if mapping an escape route from a nightmare. He fumbled for his wallet, threw a handful of crumpled bills onto the table, far more than the meal was worth, and practically fled, not even bothering to grab his jacket. He didn't look back once. The entire exchange had taken less than 10 seconds. The restaurant, which had fallen into a hush, slowly began to buzz again, but the attention lingered on their table. Nadia sat frozen, a maelstrom of emotions swirling inside her, shock, profound relief, and a hot, stinging embarrassment that her private misery had become a public spectacle. The stranger, Jinwoo, straightened up and adjusted his cuffs, his composure utterly unruffled. He turned back to her, the coldness in his eyes vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "My apologies for the scene," he said, his voice returning to its calm, respectful tone. "Some people only understand a language they are forced to hear." He gestured towards the door. "It seems your evening has been ruined. Allow me to offer you a ride home." The city is not always kind at this hour. Nadia stared at him, her mind racing. Who was this man? What had he said to Marcus? He was a complete stranger, a man who had just demonstrated an unnerving capacity for intimidation. Every instinct she'd honed since Daniel told her to be wary of strange men. And yet, in that moment, he felt like the safest person in the world. The alternative was to navigate the apathetic city streets alone, the ghost of Marcus's touch still crawling on her skin. She looked into Jinwoo's eyes, searching for a threat, for a hint of the same possessive energy Marcus had radiated. She found none. She saw only a quiet patience, an offer with no strings attached. She took a breath, a decision solidifying in her heart. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." The car was a black luxury sedan, the kind that glides through the city like a shark through water, silent, powerful, and anonymous. The interior smelled of clean leather and something faintly spicy, like sandalwood. As Jinwoo drove, the vibrant chaos of the city blurred into streaks of neon and gold behind the tinted windows, creating a hermetically sealed cocoon of quiet. The silence wasn't awkward, but it was heavy with unspoken questions. Nadia stared out at the passing lights, her reflection a ghostly overlay on the cityscape. The adrenaline from the restaurant was beginning to fade, leaving a shaky exhaustion in its wake. She replayed the scene in her mind. Jinwoo's sudden appearance, his quiet words, Marcus's terrified retreat. It didn't make sense. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice softer than she intended. "Thank you," she said, turning to look at him. "Back there." "You didn't have to do that." Jinwoo kept his eyes on the road, his profile etched by the intermittent glow of streetlights. "Some things are not a choice," he replied, his voice a low murmur. "They are a necessity. Decency is a necessity." The answer was both simple and profound, and it only deepened the mystery of the man beside her. It was an intriguing line, one that opened a dozen more questions she was too afraid to ask. He seemed to sense her unease, the lingering tension in her shoulders. He changed the subject with a deftness that suggested a high degree of emotional intelligence. "You mentioned to your date that you were reading. Before he interrupted you, he glanced at her briefly, a flicker of a smile touching his lips. What book? Nadia was taken aback. He had been listening that closely?
Oh.
It's a collection of essays on urban architecture, she said, surprised at how easily the words came. I'm a graphic designer. I find inspiration in the way lines and spaces interact in a city, and just like that, they were talking. He asked her about her work, about the difference between brutalist and Art Deco design, about the way a font could convey an emotion. He didn't just ask, he listened, his questions insightful, his attention undivided. He spoke of his own appreciation for aesthetics, for the balance and harmony in a well-composed frame, whether in art or in life. For the first time all night, Nadia felt herself genuinely relax. She was talking to this enigmatic stranger, a man who moved with the quiet lethality of a panther, about her passion for kerning and white space, and it felt more natural, more right, than anything she had experienced with Marcus. The contrast was a dizzying, terrifying, and exhilarating revelation. The man she was supposed to feel safe with had made her feel like prey. The man who was objectively dangerous made her feel, for the first time in a very long time, completely and utterly seen. They pulled up in front of her apartment building, a modest pre-war brick building with a green awning. The street was quiet, bathed in the soft, orange glow of the streetlights. Jinwoo put the car in park but didn't turn off the engine, its low hum a comforting presence in the night. I'll walk you to your door, he said. It wasn't a question. As he came around to open her door, a figure detached itself from the deep shadows of the building's entrance. Nadia's breath caught in her throat. It was Marcus. His jacket was slung over his shoulder, his tie was loosened, and his face was a mask of bruised pride and simmering rage. He had been waiting for her. I don't think so, Marcus snarled, stepping forward to block their path to the lobby. His eyes were fixed on Jinwoo, but his words were for Nadia. You think you can just embarrass me like that? Humiliate me, and then walk away with this nobody? Jinwoo didn't react, his expression remaining placid. He simply positioned himself slightly, almost casually, between Nadia and Marcus, creating a physical barrier. His body language was relaxed, yet every line of his being radiated a coiled readiness. The evening is over, Jinwoo said, his voice dangerously soft. The lady has made her choice. You should leave now, Marcus laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the quiet street. I'm not going anywhere until I get an apology. He took another aggressive step forward, puffing out his chest, trying to use his size to intimidate. From both of you, he lunged, not at Jinwoo, but reaching for Nadia. The movement was a clumsy, alcohol-fueled blur. But Jinwoo's reaction was something else entirely. It was a symphony of fluid motion, breathtaking in its speed and brutal efficiency. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't need to. He moved inside Marcus's reach, his hand deflecting the grasping arm while his other hand struck Marcus's collarbone with his knuckles. Simultaneously, he swept his leg behind Marcus's feet. It was over before it began. Marcus went down hard, his breath exploding from his lungs in a pained gasp. He landed on the pavement with a sickening thud, the fight knocked out of him completely. Jinwoo stood over him, not even breathing heavily. He looked down at the man sprawled on the sidewalk. Do not get up, he commanded, his voice devoid of all emotion.
It was a simple statement of fact.
Marcus, wheezing and clutching his chest, didn't move a muscle. Jinwoo turned to Nadia, his face softening as if he were flipping a switch. Let's get you inside. The scent of brewing chamomile tea filled the small, quiet space of Nadia's apartment. Her hands were still trembling as she poured the hot water into 2 mugs. The shock of the last few minutes was settling deep in her bones, a cold dread mixed with a strange sense of security. She handed a mug to Jinwoo, who had been standing by her large window, looking out at the glittering tapestry of the city below as if nothing had happened. He took it, his fingers brushing hers, a small, warm contact that sent a jolt through her. She sat on her sofa, curling her feet beneath her, pulling a knit throw blanket around her shoulders like a suit of armor. He remained by the window, a silhouette against the night sky. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a siren. Finally, she found her voice. Who are you? She asked, the words barely a whisper, but they carried the full weight of her fear and her burgeoning curiosity. He turned from the window, his expression unreadable in the dim light of her living room lamp. He took a slow sip of his tea before answering. "My name is Jinwoo," he said simply. He walked over and sat in the armchair opposite her, creating a space that felt respectful, not intimidating. "And I am a man who dislikes bullies." Nadia watched him, waiting for more, for the explanation that would make sense of the evening's impossible events. "What you did to him outside. It was necessary," he finished for her, his gaze unwavering. "Men like him, men who feed on the fear of others, they don't understand reason. They only understand power. Showing them a greater power is the only way to make them stop." He set his mug down on the coaster she had designed herself. "It is not a part of my life I enjoy, but it is a part of my life." He leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes searching hers. "When I saw you tonight, I recognized the look in your eyes. The forced smile, the way you were trying to make yourself smaller, less visible. It was familiar, a flicker of something pained and vulnerable crossed his features. I grew up watching my mother wear that same expression. She was married to a man, my father, who believed his love was a cage. He controlled her every move, her every friendship, her every joy, all under the guise of protecting her. He slowly tried to extinguish her light." He paused, the memory casting a shadow over him. "I saw Marcus trying to do the same to you, and I could not allow it." It was the last thing she expected to hear. Not a boast of his power or a shadowy confession of a criminal life, but a story of shared trauma, a wound that clearly had never fully healed. In that moment, he was no longer just a mysterious, dangerous savior. He was a man who understood on a fundamental level the very thing she was fighting to escape. The fear she felt began to recede, replaced by a tentative, fragile flicker of connection. A few days passed in a blur of work deadlines and restless nights. The memory of the evening replayed in Nadia's mind like a film reel, the dread with Marcus, the terror outside her building, and the startling vulnerability of Jinwoo's confession. She half expected never to hear from him again, assuming his intervention was a one-time act of chivalry born from a painful past. Then, on a sunny Thursday afternoon, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I hope you are well, Jean." Her heart did a strange little flip. It was so simple, so unassuming. It wasn't a demand for her time, or a follow-up to his dramatic rescue. It was just a quiet check-in. She found herself smiling as she typed a reply. "I am. Thank you again for everything." He wrote back almost immediately. "Would you be willing to have coffee with me tomorrow? In the light of day."
No interruptions y promesa.
She hesitated for only a second. Her fear was a loud, insistent voice, screaming about the danger he represented, the violence she had witnessed. But a quieter, more hopeful voice whispered about the kindness in his eyes, the respect he had shown her, the feeling of being truly seen. She chose to listen to the whisper. They met at a bright, airy coffee shop in her neighborhood, a place filled with the smell of roasted beans and the chatter of strangers. It was neutral territory. Safe. Seeing him in the daylight was different. Dressed in a simple gray Henley and dark jeans, he looked less like an enigmatic crime lord and more like a handsome, thoughtful man. The intense aura of power was still there, but it was softer, banked like embers rather than a raging fire. The conversation was easy, flowing from one topic to the next. He told her about his grandfather in Seoul who taught him how to play Go, a game of strategy and patience. She told him about her dream of one day illustrating a children's book. He had a surprisingly dry sense of humor, and she found herself laughing, a real, unforced laugh that came from her belly. He never once mentioned Marcus or the fight. He treated this as what it was, a first meeting, a clean slate. He asked her about her family, her friends, her favorite movies. He listened with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the bustling cafe. After an hour that felt like 10 minutes, he walked her to the corner. The afternoon's sun warmed her face. "Nadia," he said, his tone serious but gentle. "Would you allow me to take you to dinner?" A proper one this time. He paused, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "I know a place. The food is excellent, and I can personally guarantee you will not be bothered." She looked up at him, at this complex, dangerous, and unexpectedly kind man. She saw the choice laid out before her: retreat back into the cautious safety she had built, or step forward into something unknown and potentially wonderful. For the first time in a long time, the choice felt entirely her own. "I'd like that," she said, her smile genuine and radiant. "I'd like that very much." 6 months later, Nadia was laughing, her head thrown back, the sound echoing softly in the elegant, serene space. She was wearing a dress the color of a hibiscus flower, a vibrant, unapologetic red that felt like a declaration. They were seated in a private room at a Korean restaurant, one Jinwoo owned, overlooking a meticulously sculpted bamboo garden. The air smelled of ginger and sesame and tranquility. She was gesturing with her hands, telling him an animated story about a disastrous freelance project, her face alive with expression. Her light, the one he had first seen flickering under duress, was now a brilliant, steady flame. Jinwoo watched her, his chin resting on his hand, the same observant gaze from that first night in his eyes. But the clinical assessment was gone, replaced by a deep, unwavering affection that softened his entire demeanor. He wasn't just observing her anymore, he was cherishing her. The parallels to that first date were not lost on her. She was in a fancy restaurant, wearing a beautiful dress, sitting across from a powerful man. But the suffocating dread was replaced by a profound sense of peace. The feeling of being possessed was replaced by the certainty of being valued. With Marcus, she had felt like a decoration. With Jean, she felt like the main exhibit. He never ordered for her, but would instead ask, "What story do you want our meal to tell tonight?" He never touched her without her implicit permission, but when he did, his hand on her back or his fingers intertwined with hers felt like an anchor, not a chain. He had slowly, patiently, shown her what real strength was. It wasn't loud or boastful. It was quiet, protective, and built on a foundation of absolute respect. Her phone buzzed on the table. A text from Layla. "You look so happy in your latest post." "Who is this mystery man?" Nadia smiled and slid the phone back into her purse without answering. Some things didn't need to be explained. They just needed to be felt. She looked across the table at Jean, who was now smiling at her, a quiet, knowing smile. He had given her back the pieces of herself she thought were lost forever, and in return, she had shown him that his own fractured past didn't have to define his future. Sometimes, the universe doesn't send you what you think you want. It doesn't deliver the safe, predictable package you ordered. It sends you a storm, a challenge, a mystery. It sends you exactly what you need to break free. You just have to be brave enough to trust your gut when it tells you something is wrong, and brave enough to open the door when the right thing, however strange and unexpected, finally arrives.